What happens when a member of Congress asked the defense secretary whether he'd open fire on American protesters if ordered by the president? Jill Tokuda's question wasn't just bold. It struck at the very core of democracy.
Here now recognizes the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Tokuda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I agree we've had many performances today, but what we'd like is some answers. Mr. Secretary, did you invite Elon Musk for a briefing on war plans with China to the Pentagon? Yes or no is simple.
There's been a lot of hyperbole and incorrect reporting around that situation, but we did invite Elon over to come talk to us generally, but there was no war plans being discussed.
Okay, so whose idea was it to invite him to the Pentagon for a briefing? You mentioned you served at the pleasure of the president. Was it the president's will to have him come and be briefed?
Well, as you know, at that time, Elon Musk was leading up DOGE efforts, and we've taken a great investment in DOGE at DOD, and so getting his input on how we make DOD more efficient makes a great deal of sense.
Okay, but don't you think it's a conflict of interest for the world's richest man? Many of the contracts that the DOD is engaged in, billions of dollars of contracts going to his company, and he is, as to your point, was leading DOGE, which was involved in cutting hundreds of contracts, but also becoming intimately aware of the platforms and the requirements that would be given out for new contracts. Did you not think it was a conflict of interest to invite someone with financial interests into the Pentagon to have firsthand knowledge of what they could then bid on for their own, enrichment?
Ma'am, it was just an informal discussion, but I'll tell you, anyone that knows our Defense Department knows we show no preference to any company other than what your capabilities are, and we're grateful for the places where his companies benefit our national defense.
So for a $280 million donation, the world's richest man with companies intimately linked and involved in billion-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense gained access into the Pentagon. So would you say that any company right now that has multi-billion-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense has access to the Pentagon right now? 1-hour briefings with you, personally.
On the regular basis, I meet with many people and many different companies and many different aspects of our defense industrial base to ensure we have the best possible capabilities. It would be imprudent to do
Well, I'm sure for an investment of $280 million, Elon's investors are quite happy that it's come out into the billions. I want to jump questions right now. Mr. Secretary, on January 6, 2021, rioters and looters attacked federal law enforcement officials, vandalized and destroyed federal government property, and caused an estimated $2.7 billion in damages right here at the Capitol. Would you have sent the National Guard and the Marines in on that day?
Well, unfortunately, President Trump requested the National Guard in advance, and that was...
It took him quite a long time. I'm asking you, as Secretary of Defense, would you have sent in the National Guard and the Marines on that day? We had 140 Capitol Police officers injured. One died the next day. Would you have sent in the National Guard and the Marines?
As I said, President Trump directed National Guard to be there in advance.
And I think you can look at the record of how long it actually took for him to actually send them in. But it's good to hear that it sounds like you would have sent in the National Guard and the Marines on that day in which the insurrection was taking place right here at the Capitol. Mr. Secretary, during your confirmation hearing, you failed to deny the conclusion that you would carry out an order to shoot protesters in the legs. So let me be direct. Given what we are seeing across the country right now, would you carry out or issue an order by the president for our military to fire upon protesters actively engaging in their civil right to exercise free speech, their First Amendment rights? Would you give that order from the president?
I assume you're insinuating what's going on in Los Angeles, and I wouldn't call
Not just
that a
Los
peaceful
Angeles.
protest.
If we take a look at protests throughout the country, it's a simple question. If directed by the president, would you order our military to fire upon protesters? Simple yes or no.
Ma'am, we have, as you know, and as this committee knows, we have standard rules of engagement that are in place that give guidance to our troops, and they abide by them.
I'm asking what you would do. Again, you said you serve at the pleasure of the president. Is that not true?
I do serve at the pleasure.
So if the president told you to shoot people in the legs, would you do so? Now, you failed to answer this question as well in your confirmation hearing when asked by members of the Senate.
Because I refuse to accept a false hypothetical that's attempting to put me in a corner and make it look like a representation.
At a time when we have more Marines and National Guard in Los Angeles than we do in Syria and Iran alone, I don't think this is a hypothetical. This is an actual situation that we are dealing with right now. So again, I will ask the question, the last 14 seconds I have, would you order our military to shoot at their fellow countrymen if ordered by the president?
I think it's interesting that for 4 years, insurrection was the left's
I think we
favorite
know your
word,
answer. Thank you, Mr.
and
Chair.
that
I
when
yield
it's
back.
invoked in L.A., they were
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady's time's expired.
What we just witnessed wasn't a normal hearing. What if I told you a single question, delivered quietly, insistently, could take a room designed for procedure and turn it into a crossroads for a nation's conscience? That is what happened when a member of Congress stood up and asked, plainly, whether the commander-in-chief could order the military to fire on American citizens. The exchange was short. The words were sharper than the time allotted. But the shape of the moment was large. A civilian voice pushing against the shape of power, a uniformed official offering procedural deflection where a moral line was being drawn. This was not theater. It was a test, best. It asked whether the institutions set up to protect us still understand whom they are meant to protect. He wasn't just dodging a question. He was revealing the rot underneath a vow to defend the public. This matters because at its center is a civic promise. That violence is not a policy tool in domestic disputes. That force serves the common defense, not the settling of political scores. The hearing was not about personalities. It was about a single, fragile hinge upon which democracy turns. The refusal to let the instruments of war be used as instruments of politics. Democracy depends on a set of shared assumptions. That protests are expression, not rebellion. That law enforcement, not the military, answers in the streets. That when leaders feel threatened, they do not summon guns as the first language of governance. When those assumptions begin to falter, the consequence is not merely messy politics. It is a fundamental change in how power sees its people. Listen closely and you hear three patterns repeating through the exchange. Patterns that tell a larger story about how modern power protects itself. First, evidence versus explanation. The room was full of facts, dates, troop counts, past requests, but the answers supplied were thin on explanation. Or rules of engagement, a standard procedures, I refuse a false hypothetical. These phrases are not neutral. They are the linguistic scaffolding power uses to avoid a moral commitment. Words like a procedure and a guidance have the texture of safety. They sound like the sober language of institutions, but spoken in place of a direct denial, they operate as a shield. Agorite is a shield. The language turns what should be a clear moral stance into an arithmetic of bureaucracy. If the record is murky, if the hypothetical is dismissed, accountability drifts away. Immediacy matters here. When a public official declines to say a no aid ordering violence against protesters, what fills the silence is not just ambiguity. It is a vacuum where precedent can creep in. The fog of technicalities becomes a cover for possibilities that should never be possible in the first place. When the record disappears, accountability goes with it. Second, transparency in practice, traced through history. This episode did not emerge from nowhere. It echoes older moments when state power and secrecy collided with public trust. From Watergate's slow unspooling of hidden authority to Kent State's image of students shot on a campus, our history supplies cautionary frames. Those events taught us that secrecy and diffused responsibility create moral danger. The grammar of deflection used today, the invocation of protocol instead of principle, is the same grammar that once treated exposure as a threat rather than a duty. When officials hide behind procedural jargon, they repeat a dangerous lesson from the past, that the mechanics of governance can be privileged over the moral clarity that binds a republic. This is not only a theoretical line, it is tangible. It is tangible. Kent State showed how quickly military presence in civic spaces can corrode the social compact. Watergate showed how small acts of concealment, when left unchallenged, grow into institutional rot. The current exchange felt like an echo of those moments, not because it matched them in violence, but because it matched them in the instinct to obscure and the reluctance to accept moral responsibility. Third, the political reflex, the instinct to protect the institution rather than the public. In the transcript, the lawmaker reads as conscience set to public duty, insistent, deliberate, trying to translate moral concern into a recorded response. The official answers like someone guarding a vault. Careful, evasive, trained to minimize exposure. This pattern is familiar across civic histories. When institutions feel attacked, their first reaction is often self-preservation. That reflex is not merely bureaucratic prudence, it is an ethical failure when it becomes a substitute for accountability. Calling the question a false hypothetical is less a defense than a tactic. If we can frame accountability as unreasonable, then refusing it becomes acceptable. But the true test of an institution is what happens when power is asked to look itself in the mirror. Does it flinch and point to process, or does it speak plainly and refuse an unlawful command? The stakes extend beyond this hearing room. If accountability is selective, applied fiercely to the weak and sparingly to the powerful, then the moral architecture of our public life begins to tilt. This isn't about a single file or a single exchange. It's about whether justice reaches upward as readily as it reaches down. Slow down with me now. The crescendo of outrage that this exchange can produce is not the point. The point is what follows that outrage. We move from shock to reflection to choice. We remember the images that taught us to be afraid. Students on a campus, tapes in a break room, a public trust breached. But we also remember what came after. Inquiry, reform, laws that tried to bind excess. Those responses were imperfect, but they show a more hopeful possibility. That citizens can insist on boundaries and that those boundaries can be restored. The moral reflection required here is simple and exacting. Do we want a system where the default answer to political discomfort is military force, or do we want a polity where disagreement is managed through law, argument, ballots, and the messy deliberations of civic life? The survivors of past abuses, the families, the communities, the activists, deserve more than apologies. They deserve a public architecture that treats their rights as non-negotiable, even when they are inconvenient. There is a practical hope woven into this. Norms can be reinforced. Laws can be clarified. Officials can be asked repeatedly and publicly to place the burden of proof on humane principle, not on evasive procedure. Civil institutions depend on pressure from citizens who refuse to accept evasion as an answer. The recording of the exchange matters because records are the only thing that resists forgetting. Keep the question in the light. Keep asking for plain speech. Demand answers that are moral as well as legal. Because when truth becomes negotiable, democracy becomes theater. And when power hides behind process, justice becomes performance. If you believe accountability should apply to everyone, not just the powerless, keep this conversation alive. Like and subscribe for more stories that turn hearings into moral tests for our future.